I'm sure you all know me. I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming to this year's Gardner Medwin lecture, named after our founder, who founded the centre in 1959, and we have one every year. The format of today is Peter's going to do a talk for 45 minutes to an hour. Then we'll have a short time for questions, and then everyone's very welcome to come back to the Bluecoat Display Centre across the garden for some light refreshments, to have a look at the exhibition after having digested all the information about the background, and you can ask Peter some informal questions if need be there and then. So if anyone needs the loos at all, they're just outside the door here. There might be one or two latecomers because apparently there's been a problem with the trains coming through. So, but I think we'll just go as normal, and we'll just have to make allowances if people do arrive a little bit late. And if everyone could just make sure their mobile phones are switched off too, please, if you could, just so there's no interruptions during the talk. I'd just like to say, Peter has been one of our long-standing artists at the Display Centre. His work predates myself, and I've been there since 1986, so we've got a very long-standing relationship, so it seems incredibly appropriate to have him as the Gardner Medwin lecturer. And his exhibition seems to have been very enthusiastically received, so thank you all for that, and hopefully we'll be able to see you a little bit later over at the centre too. So I'll hand over to Peter now. Thank you.
Well, I'm very glad to be here. I managed to miss my train. I thought I had a ticket, but it turned out to be a booking confirmation. So when I handed it over at the barrier, having killed about 3/4 of an hour, having coffees and things, till it was time to get, I then didn't have time to get a ticket. So I'm very glad to have made it in time. We'll ignore this. This is just my focusing slide, and move right along. I'm going to try and create a little bit of context. Do we need to have these lights up quite so? What's it like here? Yeah, thanks. I mean, I can see that, but I think you see it better. Look at that. Yeah. Okay, so I think you all have heard of Bernard Leach. When I was a student, ceramics was all the rage. In fact, I studied ceramics at the Central School, and I did have tea with the great man himself on one occasion, which was a terrific experience. He was very welcoming and very kind to the student who turned up at his studio in St. Ives. I'd been on, I'd spent a year in Israel as part of my sort of growing up period, and lived on kibbutz, and he was extremely interested in that communal ideology, and as I say, that was a very nice experience. But Leach kind of there was a, how can I put it? There was almost a religious fervour to the way he worked and the way he promulgated his philosophy, and he held a lot of influence, shall we say, in the early days of ceramics. Very much, although that was when the studio glass movement started, and I'll get to that in a minute. That Leach, that truth to material ethic that he proposed, was taken up by the early glassmakers who, although glass had always been a team activity, and I'll talk more about that in a while. The early studio glass people. Do you want to take a seat here? You're all right. The studio glass movement grew out of the ceramics movement, which is partly why I'm showing these. So this is one of my teachers, Gordon Baldwin, who's now the grand old man of British ceramics. This is another of them. I was at the Central School, and this is Ruth Duckworth, who went to America, worked mostly in porcelain, went to the States and in fact became the grande dame of American ceramics till a year or so ago when she died in her 90s, sadly. Another strong influence at the time in the ceramics world was the work of Picasso. He worked in the south of France. I mean, it, you know, had an extraordinary influence in every sphere of art. This is a piece by a man called Peter Layton, who was the leader of the abstract expressionist movement of clay work, led from California. You know, it followed the abstract expressionist painting and sculpture movement from out of New York. Another strong movement in California at the time I was there, and I actually replaced this gentleman. That's a self-portrait, by the way, of you can tell I'm getting old. It'll come back to me. Anyway, he's died in the meantime, sadly, but his work's very sought after. Does anybody here know who this is?
Is it Robert Arney?
Arneson. Very good.
Yeah.
Bob Arneson, thank you. Brilliant. Well done.
Both for no cigar.
Bob Arneson. And, self-portrait, Bob Arneson. So he was one of the leaders of the funk school of ceramics. And this is a piece of mine from that time, around that time, vaguely that time. You can tell I was feeling a bit homesick by then. So I'd been at the Central, and from the Central I managed to get a teaching job in the States, partly through Ruth, or her recommendation anyway, and I taught at the University of Iowa, and then in Chicago at the Art Institute, and in California. And while I was at the University of Iowa, I participated as a student. I was teaching there, but I was a student in a glass workshop. And that was run by a chap called Tom McLaughlin, who was a student of Harvey Littleton's. This is a piece by Harvey Littleton. And he is the person who has been credited with who started the studio glass movement. So it's only roughly 50 years old. It was during the mid-60s, or the early 60s rather, that he traveled in Europe. He went to Italy and he went all over Europe on the basis, on trying to prove to himself that his father was a research scientist and director at Corning Glass. Corning is a huge glass company, or yes, still is, and it's the company that invented Pyrex, and one of Mr. Littleton's, or Professor Littleton's, credits is that he invented Pyrex. Now, his son, Harvey, worked there in his holidays as a student, and came away thinking, you know, why can't one work glass on one's own in the way that you can do pottery? He was a potter, and he was teaching pottery at the time at the University of Wisconsin. And so he travelled around Europe. He got thrown out of various factories in Murano, and he stumbled across a man called Erwin Eisch in Bavaria, and this chap was an artist who'd been trained as an engraver and painter and sculptor, but his parents owned a factory. I might have a slide of his. Let's see what we've got. Oh yes, here we are. In fact, this is a series of portraits of Harvey Littleton by Erwin Eisch. These are mold blown, but each one you can see, although had a basic mold, probably just a ceramic mold, I suspect, clay mold, you'll see they've all been modified, or they're all different. Perhaps they weren't the same mold. This statement here, technique is cheap, is something that Harvey Littleton is said to, or did say at a conference early on and the point being that, you know, the idea was much more important than technique. Nobody knew much about glassmaking in those days. I mean, you know, people like myself wouldn't have had access to glass. As I started to say earlier, it was, for centuries, I mean, since pre-Roman times when there were itinerant glassmakers wandering about, it was something that had been carried on, passed from father to son, carried on behind closed doors. In medieval times, in the Middle Ages, in Venice, firstly, they didn't want fires in Venice, so they stuck all the glassmakers in Murano, on the island of Murano. And the other thing about having them all there was they could keep an eye on them. And in fact, legend has it that they had hired teams of assassins to chase errant glassmakers, people who wanted to sell the secrets, because this was all a hugely secretive business. There were recipes for the glasses, there were secrets of how to build the furnaces, there were techniques, although the techniques haven't actually changed or barely changed for thousands of years, or a couple of thousand years anyway. Glass blowing, glass making is about 4,000 to 5,000 years old, and the Egyptians used it for jewelry and for little perfume bottles and that sort of thing, and for inlays into furniture. BC, about the 1st century BC, somebody somewhere invented glass blowing, and it happened very quickly. It wasn't there, and then it was, and then it had spread. The Roman Empire was vast, and they exported some glass. They had mostly Syrian glassmakers, I think, and wherever the armies went, the glassmakers went, and so suddenly it spread enormously fast. So originally glass was used only for luxury items, very, very for decorative items, and it was very, very precious. More precious often than say lapis was a very precious stone, but the blue glass was often more valued than that. This is at Montreal Expo in 1967. Thank you. And actually I was there, and the great sport was to try and jump the cube. It was, you can see this is outside the Czech Pavilion, which was the most wonderful pavilion, particularly if you're interested in glass. And these are pieces by an artist called René Rubicek, who is still alive, way into his 90s. And I'll show another piece by him shortly. And this is the father of Czech glass, modern Czech glass, Stanislav Libensky, a cast piece, very at the 1976 International Glass Symposium at the Royal College of Art, Libensky came, and that was the first time we'd really been shown what was going on behind the Iron Curtain, behind, the Velvet Curtain, or whatever the curtain was called. It was a revelation, and he was the star of the show, and there were a lot of big egos there. There were a lot of high flyers, Chihuly and all sorts of other little things. This is a piece I made. This is one of my early triumphs. During the 80s, there were symposia in the Czech Republic every 3 years, and in a place called Nový Bor, which is a city that specializes in glassmaking in the north of Bohemia. And this is a piece over 2 meters high, and I'd only ever made it as a small wooden model prior to this, and it was a miracle it all survived. Anyway, it was a bit like the Glass Olympics. Everybody was looking to see what everybody else was doing, and Chihuly was there working with Billy Morris, who's a very handsome, I might have a picture of him, I'm not sure, very handsome guy, works sort of bare-chested and heaves around massive pieces of glass, and they made things that were too big to go in the annealers, and that was very spectacular. I made these bars in a mold that had sliding end stops so I could reduce the size. and it was a pretty boring occupation. So thousands of people walking through, looking, but when it was all together, it caused quite a stir. It was one of my mini triumphs. Anyway, another participant was Marvin Lipovsky. He was one of Littleton's first early students. His technique is to go around the world working in various factories, trying to absorb something of the local atmosphere, environment, and using local labor and using very impromptu molds, piles of wood, and using tridents, wooden tridents, which he pokes into the hot glass as it's being blown. And then he takes the blanks that he's made away to his own studio in California and then cuts into them, and opens them up and makes these very, that's one of the nice ones, I think. And so simultaneously, and unbeknown to each other, there's a man working in Japan. People were working here and there in glass, but there was nothing cohesive till Littleton came along. This is a piece by a man called Fujita, Japanese, and it's obviously based on lacquer work. And it is a box, so these are mold-blown pieces which stack. And again, sadly, no longer with us. Fujita isn't. So something by, most of you have probably heard of Dale Chihuly. He is really the most charismatic and, how can I put it? Well, he's had the biggest influence on the studio glass world of anybody in our time. He makes his work is stunning. He employs around 100 people to help him in one capacity or another. He's probably one of the wealthiest artists in the world by all accounts, currently working. And he has organized things extraordinarily well and does make very spectacular work. Many of you will have seen this piece. It's in the V&A. And these things, I think he donated this. I wouldn't like to work under it. There's a desk below this. But anyway, these cost something in the order of about £1 million a throw a time. And there's a lot of work gone into that. If you have any questions about any of these things, don't hesitate. You can ask as we go, or you can say them up. This is somebody who came from Murano to Lino Tagliapietra, who is, again, one of the foremost glass makers in the world, and had taught Chihuly an awful lot of what he knows. I mean, it was a symbiotic relationship. They as it were, or synergistic. They used one another, and the products were extraordinary. And this is Lino's own work. He worked for Chihuly a lot, but this is his own work. And these cost in the region of over 100,000 each, anyway. He's very well respected in America, particularly. In Murano, possibly less so. They're all jealous, really. I think funny place, Murano. Anyway, this is. I've just been there, and it's actually a wonderful place. I stayed on the island recently, a couple of weeks ago, and it really is a fabulous place. This is using, again, Italian techniques, using Murini, what are called Murini, or making Murini. These are made out of canes and combined in a way to create patterns. These are by a chap called Richard Marquis, Dick Marquis. Can you see okay? I'm not in your way. And he made a whole series of these teapots early on. He's gone on to do much more exciting and interesting things, although these are very beautiful. Quite non-functional teapot. And he went to Murano to Venice on a Fulbright in the late 60s, and has been consistently at the forefront of American glass ever since. I suppose I better speed up a bit. I can't even remember whose this is. I forget his name. This is a very large piece. Not far off. That's probably about actual size. So that's pretty good bit of glass making. These are by Dante Marioni. There are a couple of Marionis who are very active in glass. His dad, Paul, is one of the pioneers of the American movement. This is by Dan Daly, who collaborates with his wife, Linda McNeil, who's an amazing metalsmith and jeweler. And his work is always very, well, this isn't such a witty example, but generally it's pretty humorous stuff and quite biting, I was going to say. These are by a Romanian called Nemtoy, Johan Nemtoy. He had a marvelous show in at the Barge House by the Oxo Tower in London. He invested a lot of money to bring this and many other pieces over from Romania. His studio is like a factory, I think, and labour there was pretty cheap, I suspect. And the trucks were standing by. You know, the exhibition went by. It was, you know, I think people who saw it from the glass world were pretty impressed. But nothing happened majorly, except that in about the last half hour before it ended, and as I say, all the removals men were actually standing there, the trucks were there, the huge Romanian guys were standing to load it. A designer walked in and called his boss, who happened to be the boss of McLaren, and said, you know, we've got to have this stuff. And in the end, they bought the whole show anyway, which was extraordinary, you know, for some millions, I think. Sam Herman, who was one of Harvey Littleton's students. So anyway, so Littleton, he met Owen Eiche and was very inspired by what he saw Eiche doing, and went back to the University of Wisconsin, persuaded the art department to let him set up a small glass department. It was all the blind leading the blind. He organized a couple of workshops at Toledo Art Museum, and the whole thing, and a number of potters came along and got very worked up about the possibilities of glass, went away, and the whole thing spread anyway. He set up a glass department at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and as I say, Dale Chihuly was one of his students, Tom McLaughlin, the chap who introduced me to glass, and Sam Herman was another, who eventually came to England on a Fulbright, or came to Britain, went to Scotland first, to Edinburgh, and then eventually got a job at the Royal College of Art, and had a very sort of broad, I mean, he was a huge breath of fresh air. At the Royal College, prior to his coming, what you did was you sat at your drawing board and you designed, you know, your perfect thing, and if you were lucky, you managed to persuade a technician to make what you'd drawn, or it went up to Stourbridge or somewhere, and maybe somebody would make it if you were lucky. He arrived and he built one of these little furnaces. The breakthrough came, really, at one of these Toledo conferences. As I said, you know, prior to that, it was huge furnaces behind factory doors. They created a small furnace that you could load at night. It had a burner, came in one day, and you worked it through the exhaust, which was the door. And he introduced this at the Royal College, and also brought this rather free, gestural way of working, and really what's happening in glass in this country is very much a result of his initial efforts. he helped start or he did start the glass house in Covent Garden, which is no longer exists, but it was quite influential for a long time. And its first manager was a woman called Pauline Solven, who was one of Sam's students, graduates. He set it up, and this is another, Stephen Newell. He set it up, really, the glass house was set up for somewhere. There weren't any studios at that time, certainly none that had public access. Very few galleries would sell glass, did sell glass. In fact, Elizabeth Zuckerman here at Bluecoat was one of the first to see the potential of glass. I mean, what most people said was, oh no, you need special lighting for glass, you know, you need backlighting to be able to show its wonderful colours and blah, blah, blah. And our customers don't have that, therefore we're not interested. And in fact, that idea, or that thought, was what inspired me to get, when I got going, when I started my studio, I got into iridizing, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. This is by Keith Cummings, who was professor at Starbridge and Wolverhampton for a number of years, and this is casting, combining metal with glass, patte de verre. These are also castings by another chap called David Reiki. This particular piece is in the V&A, and his work generally is social comment in some shape or form, and often very funny as well. Neil Wilkin, who now works down in the West Country, checkered career. Anna Dickinson, an early piece. This lady worked in my studio at one time. She also was at the Royal College. She became, or is one of the experts on electroforming on glass. So this is cut, blown, cut, and then electroformed. So that band at the top is copper, I suspect, or in this case, although she works with precious metals as well, and that is deposited electrolytically onto the glass. And she sells all her work abroad, basically, through one gallery. We see it very seldom in this country. That's an early piece. Her work's changed quite radically since, but and she commands prices between £15,000 to £25,000 per piece. So my work's very cheap, very reasonable. Race over there. Okay, this is Raquel who? Woodman. Is that what you said? Yes. Excellent. Very good. I'm just testing. Okay. Yes, Rachel Woodman, an early piece. She works with Neil Wilkin. She doesn't blow her own work. People do it for her, but she designs it. And she too is, and I'm sorry to say, I wish I had a more recent piece because her work's changed a lot and it's much more sculptural, and I should have found one to put in next time. Piece by Catherine Coleman. That's reversible, by the way, that bowl, so if you turn it upside down, it still works visually with buildings. Just change, it still work upside down. She's one of our foremost engravers. Well, one of the foremost engravers in the world, I suppose. I can't remember this chap's name. He works in Starbridge, and this is painting on what's called an embryo, a small piece of glass. He's painted this, then he's reheated it, picked it back up on the blowing iron, and the design has expanded as he's blown the piece. So, a Yorkshire couple, working in Yorkshire, in North Yorkshire, Rosedale glass, and they are called Gillies and Jones, Kate Jones and Stephen Gillies, and that is sandblast. It's blown, overlaid with colour, and then cased, blown, overlaid, and sandblasted. So the design has been
do you get this piece? It's a sandwich of clear and then red on the outside too, and he's sandblasted away the red on the inside in some areas to give that effect. Looks like there might be some black in there too. Yeah. So sandblasting is a way of getting a colour effect. This is these are a couple of pieces by our foremost glass sculptor, Colin Reed, and that's a casting. He's got a very important show on at the moment, a retrospective at Cheltenham. If any of you are in that neck of the woods, not to be missed. It's a fabulous show, really, really good show. And this is his more recent work, and that show shows a whole range of his activity, right from tiny little lampwork perfume bottles through to these big castings, big architectural castings and stuff. So really, really knockout work and very much in demand. Not frightening. You know, most of this work is under £10,000. This is using a water jet cutter, and this is Vanessa Cutler, and I think currently she's head of department of Swansea College of Art, and she is the acknowledged expert on the use of the water jet. So that means you use a computer, you feed in your design on a computer, and then it cuts the glass in a particular way for you. Another engraver, another very important engraver, Alison Kinnaird from Scotland. This is Robin Smythe from Starbridge, using a technique called slumping. And these sort of curtains have been, these lace curtains as it were, have been decorated and slumped, perhaps into something like corrugated iron, I don't know. But anyway, it has a very wind swept look about it, which works very well. This is my pottery, well, it was my pottery, in the Highlands of Scotland, near Mallaig. I don't know if any of you know that part of the world. And these tumble down shacks were, I sort of inherited them or bought it fairly cheaply. I worked there as a student. I did some work experience there, and then I went to teach in the States, and I was in America for a few years, teaching ceramics and learning about glass, discovering glass, although I burnt myself really badly after a couple of days of my first glass making session. I literally rolled hot glass over the back of my hand. I thought, well, that's that. But once you get the bug, anyway, so I potted there, and I did salt glaze, and those are, in fact, salt pots, salt-made salt pots, and I'm probably smoking some pots down in the bottom of this little chimney affair, and I'm smoking fish at the top, and that's my very first glass production. It was pretty, it was called, I must have called it Highland Mist or something. I don't know, no, I didn't. It was just mucky though. It was, I could never get rid of all the bubbles. Have you got one? And of course
you told me to throw there.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Oh, that's nice to have you in the audience. Yeah, it was a good place, wasn't it? It was a very beautiful place. Yeah. Every time I went there, I thought this is far too far away. It was about 600 miles from where I lived. In those days, the roads weren't very good, so I'd always think I was going to get rid of these places. You know, when I got there, I found, it was such an spectacular bit of countryside that I hung on to it for far too long. Anyway, yes, David was one of the students. I ran a summer school one year, and a couple of years, I think. Anyway, this is a bit of my...
Peter, when I went, I could throw a cylinder about 6 inches. And at the end of your fortnight with you, I could make teapot, coffee pot, and I made a bread crock, 18 pound of clay. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Did we do any glass?
We did some glass blowing, we did, yeah.
Yeah, I had gas cylinders outside, and I think we just used them until we ran out of gas. We just one weekend, you know, I said, come on, let's build a little furnace and see if we can make some glass. Anyway, this is my first experiment with glass, and it was with that chap Keith Cummings, who used to work at Whitefriars Glass, and these were made when I was a student at the Central, and I was just trying to experiment with the idea of combining glass and clay, and that was a very popular thing to do at that point, but people used to just sort of melt glass into the bottom of dishes and bowls and things, and I wanted to actually find a way of doing it. These were, as I say, were just test pieces, but a way of doing it so that, you know, the glass was transparent. And I did make a screen eventually doing that. But anyway, and then I went, you know, following that, I went to teach ceramics in Iowa and came across glass blowing, and it was the most amazing experience. As long as it lasted, it wasn't very long. I burnt myself and I nearly killed myself, both within the first 2 or 3 days. Anyway, this is an early piece. Then I helped Sam Herman set up the glass house, Covent Garden, and I just dabbled around, you know, but eventually I thought, well, I'm really much more interested. I had a big exhibition. I think I might show you a couple of pieces later. A big ceramics show at the Commonwealth Institute, Commonwealth Art Gallery, which was that marvelous flyaway building, you know, with a building with a flyaway roof in Kensington High Street, the old Commonwealth Institute, and I made these pots. Well, I made these sculptures, ceramic sculptures and things, and then that was all very cerebral, and I wanted to get my hands into something, and I somehow hadn't got glass out of my system. So I searched around for ages. I worked at the glass house for a while, and then I searched around to find myself a studio, and I found an old towage works on the banks of the Thames, literally overlooking the Thames in Rotherhithe. And in fact, this is a piece, and I iridise. If you look at the blue bit up there, you can see there's an iridescent glow to it. It's sort of techniques that Tiffany used. And I'd had this experience of hawking my glass around some galleries, as I say, who weren't particularly interested. A, the glass wasn't very good, and B, they didn't want to know about glass, even other people's glass from the glass house and so on, because they had difficulty displaying it. So I thought, well, I need a type of glass that doesn't have that problem of needing all this fancy lighting and backlight. And I hit upon the idea, not me alone, I mean it was happening in California, other people were doing this iridizing, but it involved a fair bit of research before I discovered how to achieve some of these colors and things. And, you know, it was a real eureka moment when I got this blue, this electric blue. I made a lot of these sort of shell forms at that time. And iridizing was really, you know, the thing that put my studio on the map at all. But it's a very unpleasant process. It's toxic, and you need to have very good extraction. And I'm not sure we had it, but I'm still here anyway. But the other thing is, you know, the emissions aren't that great. Luckily, we were on the Thames, and the wind was blowing, and I felt, you know, in those days people didn't. This was going back to the mid-70s. And people, or mid to late 70s, people weren't quite as fussy. I think we were still sawing up asbestos, as I remember it, and things like that, you know. And when I was a student, you know, we'd have a lead glaze, you know, we'd dip a pot in a lead glaze, and then we'd use something like a Brillo pad, you know, no mask or anything, you know, it was crazy. I mean, it's a miracle. I survived. Anyway, this is a piece probably related, it's called what I call an ice basket, and it's related to my potting history, because as a potter, I could throw all right, but I was more interested in the hand building, you know, like that piece, you know, the Buckingham Palace piece. It was called Caesalis, that soldier, you know, with the busby. That was slab built, but coiling was another technique, and I thought, I thought you should be able to coil in glass, and I've made a whole lot of these ice baskets, and that is etched to give it that sort of slightly matte finish. This is a piece that's in the Fitzwilliam in their collection, quite a large bowl, and it was for a long time the most expensive piece I'd ever sold, so I was very thrilled with that purchase. And it was based on a trip to, a lot of my work sort of has travel connotations, and this, I'd been to Petra in Jordan, and which is a city carved out of, anyway, it turned into kind of desert scenes like that. This is a technique we evolved in the studio. It's called spirali, where I spiral up the glass in a particular way. And we're not making this at the moment. Sometimes designs fall out of fashion. And anyway, you just want to move on and do different things. But these were quite well received for quite a while. This is an early Paradiso piece, big yellow Paradiso, big bow, and you know when you've got a good piece because you just recognise that this one's brilliant. You know, this one's really worked. And again, I got a very good price for it. So an American walked in just after I'd made it. I didn't really want to sell it, and that's also a good ploy. And anyway, it went into the collection fairly quickly. But yeah, what else? Let's show you some more. So a couple of winters ago, we had quite a lot of snow. You'll remember, 2 or 3, and I was commuting in those days through Kent, looking out through the train windows, and it reminded me of these sort of black and white areas. Reminded me of some previous work I'd done in black and white, and I sort of decided to revisit that. And so I made a lot of black and white pieces. You know, it was sort of inspired by snow on hedgerows and trees and fields, and then I started to introduce some colour. I called it glacier, and it didn't look glacier-like, icy enough. So then I introduced some colour, and then somebody said something about fire and ice, so I introduced some red. You know, these things have a way of evolving. But, and then a year or two ago, I was approached by the Royal Academy to do some pieces inspired by Hockney, by paintings of David Hockney's. He had a big show, I think it was April last year, called The Bigger Picture or something. Anyway, it was a fabulous show. You know, the night, wonderful. I mean, people just came out of there smiling. You know, it was so uplifting. Anyway, I chose a couple of different paintings. This one was based on a painting called Garraby Hill, which is a landscape near where he works or lives. And I don't know what's oh, this is detail of it. And whoops, so quite painterly in a way, you know, in an abstract way. That's just detail of that. This is a girl who worked with me for a number of years down in Rotherhithe, called Siddy Langley. It's a piece by her. She's down in Devon now. And she breeds llamas, and she's building what's called an echo studio. I don't know how that works, but so that's a nice piece of hers. This is my team. So this is the latest arrival, Tim, who makes very nice work, Tim Rollinson, and Bruce Marks, and Jochen Ort, Hannah Ennemark, Lane Rowe, and Louis Thompson with the blowpipe in his hand. And we're blowing, we don't use moulds very often, but this is a huge wooden mould we're blowing a very large sphere as part of, which is then going to be cut up and engraved and modified as part of a sculptural light fitting for a millionaire's apartment in the Shard. I don't know if you know, there are some apartments on about the 30th floor that cost about £30 million each. And in one of them is this absolutely stunning light sculpture, not designed or made by us, but we made the glass for it.
Peter, is this in Bermondsey Street?
This is in Bermondsey Street, by our back door. This is just outside. So he's standing up on a ledge, there on a ledge, and this is our car park. So, yeah.
And the showroom is the other side?
The showroom is down where the
got it.
exit side
Okay.
is, yeah. Somewhere over there in that corner. And all of these guys who work in the studio, well, in fact, I'm going to show you their work. They all work for themselves, and they help me with my work. So these are pieces by Louis Thompson. Louis is absolutely flavour of the month. He won the Jerwood Prize and the best in the Biennale in the last year or two, and he's showing at SOFA, which is in Chicago right now. And SOFA is a wonderful art craft show, the best in the world really, and the work there is stupendous. And he's showing there, as am I, but I think he's going to make a much bigger impact. This is another piece by him, and we sold this piece at Collect last year, for a goodly sum, as I'd say. It was our first time showing at Collect. Collect is a really good show, organised by the Crafts Council, and it's located these days. It used to be at the V&A, and now it's at the Saatchi Gallery in the King's Road, and it's modelled on SOFA. SOFA stands for Sculptural Objects and Functional Art, and but Collect, I'm glad to say, is it was proved worthwhile. We're doing it again this year, so do come. You're all invited. Bring your checkbook. No, I'm joking. This is another piece by Louis Thompson, by the way. This is a piece he won the Biennale Prize with. So you can see how big these are. And actually they're held down with magnets. So there are magnets under that. And in fact, we had this piece in our gallery. We've got a gallery at my studio. And it was the Bermondsey Festival, and we were absolutely mobbed. And I was terrified that this wasn't going to survive. Somehow it did. It was just right down the middle of the gallery, and miraculously, it would have gone down like ninepence, wouldn't it? One bang, 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 bang. Which is awful. Anyway, these are a couple of pieces by Bruce. He's the hefty guy on the left-hand corner, if you remember. Do you want me to refresh your mind? No, you don't. You're not that good. Anyway, he makes these forms called birds, amongst other things. In fact, and these are some other forms based on caterpillars or chrysalis or something. Nice colours. And this is a piece by a girl who isn't around at the moment, but she'll probably be back. She's on maternity leave. Marie Home. You can tell she's Danish. She's into Lego. Not Lego. Yeah, Lego. Yeah, Lego. This is by Jochen Ott. He's a young German who works with us. His thing is cutting. He does blow these forms too, but then he, cuts them very deeply. Cutting on a lathe with diamond impregnated wheels. It's particular skill, and he has it. This is another piece of his, and we showed that piece at Collect last week. This is another girl. His girlfriend, actually, Laura McKinley. She works in our gallery, but she makes glass as well. These are by Tim, who happens to be my daughter's boyfriend. And at the moment, touch wood, we're selling every single piece he can make. So he just puts them out and away they go. So somebody, which is great. Let's hope it will continue. These are by Lane Rowe. These are really complicated pieces to make. So let me try and run. Are you interested in this? Is this? Yeah. What's happening here is that this is made up of a lot of coloured canes. So he's made all the canes. He's pre-made the canes and laid them out. They're overlaid with various colours. So I don't know how many layers, probably 2 or 3 layers. He picks them up, preheats them, picks them up, rolls some glass, a cylinder of glass over them, picks them up and so they're picked up as a cylinder then, and then he starts to blow and shape by reheating and blowing and shaping. He makes a form like this, and in fact this is a close-up. You can maybe see better.
How big is it?
That's quite a good sized piece, roughly, what's that, about 15, 16 inches diameter, about that sort of height. And then when it's cold, and he twists the cane so he gets this spiraling movement, and then cuts on a diamond wheel, cuts through to expose the colours inside the canes. Cuts it through in the opposite direction. So here's another example. Just using black and white in this case. And clear. Black, white, and clear. Somewhat Venetian in character, but each of us is trying, we're all trying to develop our own direction, our own way of working. This is also by Lane. Lane's also, doing extremely well at the moment. He's in a show in Brighton with that includes people like Grayson Perry at the moment. And I think this piece, and unfortunately I don't have a shot of it, but there's a pistol he's made with flowers in the barrel. So they're sort of anti-war pieces. We have an anti-war thing going on in our studio. These are a couple of pieces by Anthony Scala, who first came to my studio as a boy of about 8 or 9, I believe, and then he went away and finished his studies and qualified as an architectural model maker. So he's pretty anal, and this piece and the next one are owned by David Attenborough. He makes these things that take forever to make. So this sphere that you can see, he's blown several pieces, cut them, deconstructed them, cut them probably as a cube, then turned that cube, that quartered cube, into a sphere by grinding and polishing, so that it fits it perfectly into this crescent shape, which then fits on this base. Huge amount of work. And this is another of his pieces, a more recent piece. And his work's changing again. I think he's finally realised that, to work, with that sort of level of precision to deconstruct and reconstruct pieces, with amazing glues, and can be a bit soul destroying, hour after hour after hour. And if something, we had some idiot came into the studio the other day. He's got a couple of pieces on, and there's quite a large sign we've got a show of cast glass on at the moment, pretty nice show, in which he has 2 or 3 of his new pieces, and he's using those balls on a little base, and it says, "Please do not touch." Now we normally encourage people to touch, but there's a notice, quite a large notice, says, "Please do not touch," and somebody picks it up and starts turning the ball, and it's scratched badly. And so, and Anthony, because he's such a perfectionist, isn't going to be content to try and get this scratch out, repolish it, grind it. I mean, if he grinds a bit of it, it's not going to be a proper sphere anymore, you know, and it won't turn. So he's going to have to grind away the whole thing to make, you know, it'll end up with a smaller sphere, I suppose. This is somebody else who's in the studio, a girl called Catherine Schilling. She helps us curate our shows. And this is using another technique called fusing. Fusing and slumping in a way. Fusing, in this case, just very thin canes of glass, which she's laid in a mesh flat, and then heated up and distorted as she was, either by what's called slumping, folding them over something, or by manipulating them hot as she, while you know they're at a high temperature, about 700 or 800 degrees centigrade. Quite a dodgy thing to do. Here's another one. This is a piece by another person in this current casting show, Yoshiko Okada. She now lives in the Pyrenees, in the south of France, or in Perpignan, or somewhere like that. And she will be in our show in Collect. And most of her work has been based around self-portraits of one sort or another. So casting involves having a mold and making a model, making a mold, firing the piece up to a temperature where the glass melts to take up the form of the mold, and then, in her case, grinding and polishing ad nauseum, and then a little bit of some sandblasted areas. So this is a piece of mine, with a particular colleague, Simon Moss, who's no longer working with me. We did a lot of architectural pieces, mainly on cruise ships, cruise liners, but this was a land-based piece. This wasn't finished, hadn't been landscaped. It's in an office park near Leatherhead, and that's about 7 meters tall, 6 or 7 meters tall, stainless steel and glass. So here's Hockney. I grew up in Bradford. We knew each other in those days. I don't know if that's why the Royal Academy approached me, but anyway, and we met one another in California, and I taught at the University of Iowa the year after he'd been there. So we've kind of crossed paths from quite time to time. So I was pleased, I was delighted when I was asked to try and interpret a couple of his paintings. And there's one painting, it's about as wide as this room almost, called Arrival of Spring. And this is my kind of version of it.
What did he think of the stove, Peter?
I don't know, to be honest. I did mean to send him a piece, but I haven't got round to it yet. I assume he knows, but he hasn't. You know, we move in slightly different circles. We know each other. You know, I met him at the Private View. He says, he looked me up and down. He says, "You're not looking bad for your age. We're the same age." And he said, "I'm still smoking, you know." And then all these pretty ladies sort of hustled him out of my reach, you know. So we didn't have much of a conversation. But these have been very successful. We've sold them really well. The Royal Academy have sold them well, and we have too. Have you had them here?
Yeah.
Have you sold any?
Popular,
Yeah, good. They are good because these colours, these greens, funnily enough, you know, I never touched green for years. One of the galleries I sold at, Cecilia Coleman, she's still going, one of the few that's still going. She said, I can never sell anything green, so I never went near green for years. And anyway, these greens seem to have worked a treat, you know, but they are very complex. We build them up in, a lot of the colour in my work is built up in layers, and that achieving this variation in the green is quite complicated and time-consuming. I was saying to somebody, we made it for a couple of days, so it's still in the annealer. I haven't seen it. This was on, we made it on Tuesday, and it was a very, very big piece. It was partly in response. I wanted to do it anyway and make some big ones, but anyway, we'd had an American walk in. The Americans are great. We don't see many of them, but they've got space and they've got money, and they want you to work big. So this chap said, I want a ginormous piece. So we started small, about this size, you know. We're going to work up to something bigger if we can. I don't know. And it took about 3 hours. Now, if you take, in a factory, if they take more than about 5 minutes to make a piece, that's a long time. In our studio, on an average, we think maybe an hour and a half. This piece took nearly 3 hours. Firstly, to put the colour on and then to blow it. And what was so unfortunate in a way was, do you know how this blowing works? Hang on, I'll go back a bit. I'll go back one. This is a sphere, possibly not unlike the one we made. Only this probably is only about so big. And so it's blown through that little hole at the top. That's on the end of your blowing iron. And the way we finish things in the studio, in a factory, again, they just knock it off and perhaps they'll grind and polish the top and they call that hand blown, which it is, or it may be. In fact, I'm going to try using that idea. I've finally come to the conclusion that's not a bad idea. But we don't do that. We attach what's called a punty to the bottom. So that's another hot bit of glass on another different rod. We break it off at that end, and it's rough. And then we work on finishing the top. We reheat the top, and if you're not careful, if it's too cold, it'll crack when you go into the glory hole, which is the reheating chamber. Or you can achieve what you wanted to achieve. You know, you end up getting... Anyway, to cut a long story short, how are we doing on time, by the way? Are we all right?
Yeah.
We're getting fairly close to the
Yeah,
end, I think.
you've been going for about an hour.
Right. Anyway, to cut a long story short, it broke off. It didn't break off badly, but I wanted the hole smaller. It broke off with a hole maybe that size, because it's a big piece, and I wanted the hole smaller, so we started fiddling about to make the hole small. And we ended up fiddling about for an hour or an hour and a half. Now that's with a huge piece on the end of the punty. You've got to reheat and heavy, and that's it was a silly thing to do. And what I wish I'd done was turn it. You see, that's what you could do. I wish I'd turned it into something like this. I just pushed it in. I thought of it, and I didn't. I don't know. Not enough conviction, really. Would have been a great solution. Anyway, I haven't seen the piece. It might be all right. Might be good. Who knows? So here's some more spheres. This is another series called Nautilus, and it's inspired by those pictures of Earth from the air. Have you seen there's a wonderful book, where he's got a different picture for each day of the year. His name's Bertrand Artus, and he flies all over the world photographing things from aerial photographs of amazing things, carpets in an Indian market or the mouth of a river, which is what the Nautilus was. So these are another commission that I got from another collaboration, if you like, in this case, with the National Gallery, and they said choose it. They did the same thing. They saw what had happened at the Royal Academy and thought that's a good reason. And they never had much glass at the National before, and they said choose a couple of, and I chose this. You can all tell who it's by, right? It was inspired anyway by Van Gogh's Wheatfield, and it took a lot of doing. We did lots and lots and lots of different skies, and lots of different attempts to create a wheat field. And in fact, the way we ended up doing it is by making two separate pieces basically and putting them together just prior to blowing. And it seems to have worked. Again, people seem to like it. It's going down very well. These are probably more expensive than a lot of my work. I think this little piece, it was only little, sold for about £1,000. So, yeah, it's good. I'm enjoying it. I'm developing that now into another series based on Klimt. So I'm working my way through various painters. Yeah, you know, this bit was really inspired me to go on. And so look out for that. That hasn't appeared yet. This is, I just telling Maureen, this is a new design. This is the latest design. It's called Cascade. And again, it's proving very popular, which is great. You know, we've just produced that really for Christmas. And I'm sorry you haven't got it either. Place your order now. Anyway, I was just the last few slides now. These are slightly more conceptual pieces. So this is a piece that was in that Commonwealth Art Gallery show. It's a ceramic piece with platinum cows. And the whole series was called Please Keep Off the Grass. So it was very early ecological. I think this was 1970, early 70s anyway, 72 maybe. And so this was called Six Pack, and you can decide for yourself whether they're bombs or breasts or... Anyway, it was about, you know, not polluting the milk or the grass. And this is flocked metal, that furry stuff. This is another piece called Running Out, which again was slightly ecological, and oh God, what in those timers, I've forgotten. I mean, pebbles and feathers and glass eyes and corn and egg. Yeah, I won't say too much. This is a variation on that, recycling the neon, I think. And these are things like trust, respect, charity. I can't read them, but things like that. Respect, there's a good one. You know, running out. So you know, I do make these pieces which are comments from time to time. This is called Battery, and these are hearts, alien hearts, and they're glass and felt and fibre optic, and the fibre optic pulse is like a beating heart, and some of them are fairly vile colours like that. So here's another version, some 27 or 30 years later, of the bomb idea. So it's moved on a little bit, turned it into glass, and the green bits are a particular kind of glass, or they're meant to represent a particular kind of glass. They're meant, it's uranium glass. And so this particular piece has to do with this theory that if you encase uranium waste in